Hello and welcome. So, I'm going to do a little reading of a section from Sloterdijk's book, What Happened in the 20th Century. And there's a section in this book which discusses, well, I'll just read the title. From the domestication of the human being to the civilizing of cultures. So, this is a chapter which is very reminiscent of another essay of Sloterdijk's called Rules from the Human Zoo. Rules from the Human Zoo is an essay basically. It's kind of on biotech. It's warning us against the misuses of biotechnology, but it's also encouraging us to think about the process of man trying to domesticate himself. Well, what Sloterdijk will call auto-domestication. Humans have a history of domesticity. This is one of Sloterdijk's projects is to inquire into a kind of philosophical history of domestication, and um, of course biotech would be the if we were to walk into the era of biotech without doing this history of them, without thinking through a history of domestication and a philosophy of domestication, we would be in a lot of trouble for obvious reasons. I mean, you don't have to be particularly creative to think of many of the misuses of these technologies. Like, people are too aggressive. We have to control them with technology. Blah blah blah. Right. So that's sort of, I suppose, just a sort of background to why this is an important section. Um, so the subtitle to this is Pastoral Metaphysics: The Discovery of the Problem of Domestication. So in this section, it's basically Sloterdijk is going to give us a bit of that history here. He's going to give us a bit of that philosophical history of auto domesticity. We will begin with Plato and the Greeks. Um, I'll just read, and then I'll discuss a little bit. So he says, in a novel manner, the founder of the Athenian Academy, Plato obviously, attempted to precisely conceive the traditional praxis of educator and statesman, with a reference to a kind of anthropological difference that opened up a fissure within the essence of being human. Because human beings in advanced cultures cannot be by nature what they nevertheless are by nature, they must be educated as individuals and made to submit to rational governance as citizens. Okay, so to stop for a second, simple terms. When we organize ourselves into more complex social orders, we do we sort of grind against what is natural in many ways. We sort of grind against a natural order, a natural disposition. It's not particularly controversial to argue that. Okay, I'll keep reading. Education and political stewardship are two fields of praxis in which the incapacity of human beings in advanced cultures to fulfill themselves without guidance from others, putting in ancient terms, to obey their own nature, is manifested in a particularly noticeable way. In more closely defining pedagogical and state cybernetic functions, Plato reaches back for images and analogies that are taken from the pastoral sphere. The dialogue statesman is the primary source for Plato's pastoral theory of politics in its fully developed form. Here we encounter a famous and still somewhat scandalous turn of phrase according to which the art of the political steward is an art of shepherding, and also he's saying an art of shepherding the featherless, hornless bipeds of unmixed breeding, along with the telling addition that since tyrannies are never an option for the Greeks in general and philosophers in particular, politics is concerned with a voluntary supervision of a herd of creatures living together of their own volition. Okay, so if you read The Statesman, one of Plato's lesser known dialogues, it's kind of like, it's similar to the Republic in many ways, but insofar that it's thinking about like ideal leadership and what's the point of kind of political leadership and so forth. Um, but it does so on somewhat controversial terms, which are pastoral and also kind of zoological. Um, so we are used to thinking of political leadership in contemporary terms in this very technocratic way. I think that's like the main thing that people think of when they think of a politician. They're kind of like a manager of some sort, like a technocrat who manages over, kind of bureaucratic systems and economies and legal orders and so on and so forth. We tend to neglect the history and the function of what you could call, in simple terms, the civilizing process, which, of course, in the end of history, we presume is completely done and over, and we are complete, marvelous, rational, brilliant people. if you really think that, well, then I'm sorry, you should just stop watching this video. But anyway, so statesman is very much a view of the political leader from the perspective of kind of, in polemical terms, we could say, of the process. He guides over the process of domestication. Now, I've written on this dialogue as well in a text which I'll be releasing very, very soon. So I might do a little video on that as well. But Plato's, I just want to point out that in that text, and this is actually not something which Sloterdijk points out here, but he does point out in Rules from the Human Zoo, which is that Plato is very careful to not say, look, we need to like make people behave themselves well, or we need to like tame them or something, in the simple sense that Plato's ideal was actually a fusion between kind of warlike courage and philosophical temperance and wisdom. So there was a fusion of kind of seemingly paradoxical components. And when we talk about domestication, it's kind of controversial term. We're probably more inclined to think of something more degrading, something more sort of controlling. I don't know, like the way we've domesticated wolves into dogs, for example. That's something which could be seen as insulting, So just to point out, Plato's original use of this wasn't an argument for, like, making people easily controllable or something like this, or making people weak in some sense. It was simply a sort of observation of the fact that when we go from being in a kind of more pre-civilized state into a more complex civilized state, we do have a risk of going against our nature, of setting up orders and moral, we could say, like a moral imperatives, which may grind against what is kind of a natural predisposition of the way things are. So, and also because it's Greek, and I think that you could expand this into Christianity then, and then liberalism, that alteration of a kind of natural order into a civilized order has to be done on somewhat voluntary terms. The shepherd, the leader, the kind of conductor of this whole affair, he's not necessarily dictating and demanding everyone do this. It is something which is somewhat realized as a necessity and sort of voluntarily taken up by people, not purely in a kind of hierarchical sense of authority, but somewhat as a response to the recognition of the necessity which comes from people themselves. We have a history of that sort of self-recognition of this need to civilize ourselves, which goes from Plato, I think, to Christianity, to liberalism. I think that's fair to say. Although it's changed, all of those three different stages are radically different to each other, but it's changed over time. I would say one way that it's changed is that Plato had a much different understanding of the civilizing process to liberalism, of course. In Plato's texts, we do see something somewhat scandalous for our modern tastes and morals, because we do encounter this observation of people more transparently zoologically, and more transparently within a division between kind of slavery and freedom, and barbarism and civility. Like these more radical, more polemic terms are still present in Plato, whereas they got filtered down in Christianity, I think. And then, of course, in liberalism, it's completely filtered down. Although in liberalism, we also have to admit that this colonialism brought back these very classical terms into our mindset. Obviously, now that's not, like that's not the case. But for a history, particularly in like the 19th century, liberal societies sort of reincorporated these sort of classical terms, more radical terms of like barbarism and civilization, but it just did so within a very kind of like ethnic way, where the ethnic peoples of the third world were seen as barbarians and so forth, which actually isn't the way Plato wanted it. He didn't want this to be based purely on ethnic grounds. He wanted this self understanding of domestication and self civilizing to be based on kind of pedagogical grounds more so than simply racial. So actually, the more kind of racialized understandings of civilization which emerged in liberal modernity actually also don't fit with the Platonic model either. Anyway, how these things all fit together and distinguish each other from each other is maybe another question. I just thought I'd mention a little bit about that. So the next input we have, which maybe kind of fits into our theme there I was just talking about with the 19th century. We have the next stage of the theory and the kind of sort of this philosophical history of domestication, which Sloterdijk will bring us to here. I'll just read. He says the second discovery that is necessary to train human beings to be human beings occurs under radically different circumstances in the 19th century, after Darwin naturalized the history of the species and placed the human being at the end of an evolutionary line that showed so-called Homo sapiens to be a cousin of the hominidae. Ever since, the traditional pedagogical question of how human beings are to be formed into human beings has been ever overshadowed by evolutionary biology. Instead of the tension between unreason and reason, we now have the antagonism of wilderness and civilization, or to put it in mythological terms, of Dionysian and Apollonian powers. Only in such a situation can the talk of domestication assume a serious tone. Now the formation of human beings is no longer merely to be conceived metaphorically as entry into the house of reason, but is supposed to literally be conceived as leaving behind the animal wilderness for civilized domesticity. This occasions Nietzsche's unsettling intervention. He was one of the first to recognize that the process of generation, in the literal sense, always also implies instances of self-breeding and, in his view, usually a kind of progressive self-abnegation in thrall to the ideal of priestly and anti-aristocratic prejudice. Hence, the provocative verse from the song of the virtue that makes small one of the best sections in Zarathustra, in my opinion. In the third part of the Zarathustra, so he's quoting Nietzsche now. He says, so this is Nietzsche. At the bottom, these simple ones want one simple thing, that no one harm them. To them, virtue is whatever makes modest and tame. This is how they made a wolf into a dog, and mankind himself into mankind's favorite pet. Okay, so basically, what we have here is I'll leave Nietzsche aside for just a second. We have the next stage in this observation of auto-domestication, right? Which is reminiscent of what I was saying earlier, right? In the 19th century. So we have Plato and the Greeks, and then the history of Christianity, and then we have the 19th century, and these are the I suppose ancient Greece and then 19th century Europe would probably be, well, 19th century America as well. So we have 19th century West would probably be the two major historical points of concern here. And the difference between the two, I'll just repeat what he says because I think it's quite a good summary. Okay, so yeah, he says the second discovery that is necessary to train human beings into to be human beings occurs under radically different circumstances in the 19th century after Darwin naturalized the history of the species and placed the human being at the end of an evolutionary line that showed so-called Homo sapiens to be the cousin of the sorry, it's a Latin term. I always struggle pronouncing this. Hominidae, I suppose just whatever that, the Latin term for homo, plural. Ever since the traditional pedagogical question of how human beings are to be formed into human beings has been overshadowed by evolutionary biology. So we have a change in how we think about the sort of development of the human being. It becomes overshadowed by evolutionary biology. It becomes the focus of natural science. Instead of the tension between unreason and reason, which was more common in the classical sense, the dividing line between being civilized or barbarous, also freedom and slavery, came in the 19th century then not through thinking about reason and how we relate to reason, but it came through more so through an understanding of evolutionary biology. So instead of the tension between unreason and reason, we now have the antagonism of wilderness and civilization. Okay, so we have the antagonism now of wilderness and civilization instead of reason and unreason. So wilderness and civilization becomes a new way of understanding the schism between those that are free and those that are slaves, those that are civilized and those that are barbarians. And the process of civilizing then becomes a kind of civilizing order, expelling the wild, expelling the wilderness out further and further, sort of indefinitely as well, you would say, if you take the kind of linearity, the historical linearity of the 19th century into account as well. A linear, progressive expulsion of the wilderness becomes the way in which we then become more civilized, more human, more free, instead of the classical understanding where a kind of, what was the classical civilizing process? That's a question for another video, but I would say a more complex array of practices which involve, which at least largely involve the use of reason. That is replaced with this kind of modern scientifically reductive framework. So just to bring up something else, it does seem that something which emerges, and as someone who has read a decent amount of Plato, I do notice that this question is being asked in Plato. Like the Greeks have this kind of exist within this higher state of a civilized order, and they're sort of wondering why they exist in that order and other people don't. Like what's happened, what's the distinguishing factors which make them different. And I think Plato's definitely wanting to understand that. And part of his philosophy is to understand that by coming up with a sort of mechanism of kind of understanding principles by which the distinction between civilized and barbaric exist upon, and those principles are in a classical sense very distinct from the modern understanding. Just like in the 19th century, you had these advanced Western powers, and then you had these kind of more primitive peoples in the third world and so on. And there must have been a lot of thought that was going in at the time into well, like, why are we so advanced, quote unquote advanced, and why are these other people still in these kind of primitive states? it does make you think. Like, you can't blame people for thinking about this, even if their answers are wrong, or even if their answers are kind of snobbish and, kind of self-gratifying and so forth. You can't help but think about it. The problem was, of course, that in the 19th century, for various reasons, this way of thinking about these distinctions became very scientific, and it sort of replaced reason as a mechanism of engaging with these distinctions between freedom and unfreedom, civilization and barbarism, and it brought in itself a kind of domesticating order, which was expelling all the wilderness, expelling everything that is unsuitable to that order. And then, of course, you have Nietzsche, who intervened and said, wait a minute, what if your sort of civilizing processes are actually making us in some sense worse? What if your civilizing processes are making us more unfree? What if your civilizing processes are making us, are turning us from wolves into dogs? That's, again, it's a polemic. It's not something that sounds good. If you say, look at these third world people, they're primitives, they're stupid, they're irrational, they're slaves, and you say, look, we're so enlightened, we're smart, we're advanced, we're virtuous, that sounds good. But hold on a minute, like, let's actually look at, like, concrete examples of domestication. Let's look at the evolution, or the de-evolution, we could say, of a wolf into a dog. Suddenly that doesn't look so good. And that's Nietzsche's basic point, I think, here, right? And then since Nietzsche, we've had basically another history of kind of polemics against the civilizing process. We've had a sort of tradition of pointing out the de-evolutionary and self-degrading and mutilating processes, which are perhaps unseen or untalked about, unnoticed, unrecognized, but clearly exist within these processes themselves. And then therefore any notion of a kind of civilizing order needs to include those kind of critical polemics within it.